So this week on Coffee Break, we're going to be talking about handheld consoles, such as like the Game Boy DS and the Sony line and all that, and sort of where the future of handheld consoles is going, if there is one for them. So just to kind of start things off, I did want to ask you, Janet, actually about the Sony side of handheld games, because I've never had like a PSP or the PS Vita, even though I know you didn't have the Vita, but you did have the PSP, and I never played any of those. I'm like strictly like a Nintendo gal when it comes to handheld consoles. So I'm sort of curious about what those lines look like and like what value there is in the Sony handhelds.
Yeah, I always thought there was a lot of value in the Sony handhelds. Like you said, I had a PSP, and I had it around the same time I had the Nintendo side of the handhelds as well, I think, though I'm not sure what gen lines up exactly off the top of my head. But the PSP was amazing, and so was the Vita, even though I never bought it, and no one ever bought it, which is why it's dying.
Yeah.
But just the power of the systems, like I think it's really interesting how Sony's handheld and also like a lot of other companies outside of Nintendo have systems that are so much more powerful than the Nintendo systems in terms of what they're capable of doing and in terms of the graphics. And yet Nintendo still remains, if not a competitor, a victor. Especially we look at the handheld side, and Nintendo's definitely the winner on that end. Their only competitor being Sony, and Sony being kind of wounded at this point in terms of handhelds. But the graphics were incredible. I mean, it was just able to do so many things. Like it had all the, even though this doesn't matter to me as much as a gamer, having apps and things like that, I think that's actually probably where Sony and Microsoft, they kind of hurt themselves with all the other things they have. Like Nintendo, one thing I really respect about Nintendo, even though they are like stuck in that, they're very like, cliche old manish. They want things done a certain way, and they're very like, we've seen them censor a lot of things, and they're very prudish on a lot of stuff, and they're like late to indies, and they're kind of behind on some things, but they're solely video games. And Sony and Microsoft have never been that. Their companies are also not that. Video gaming is very much something they do on the side, but the PSP, the thing I loved about it was it had amazing graphics. You had you could have movies on there, you could have music on there, and I liked a lot of the games they had on there. I mean, Chains of Olympus was not a very good game necessarily. It was a God of War game, but they had like Daxter, they had like Need for Speed on there. You could just like face off with people. Yeah, I thought it was a really great system. It was beautiful. And as far as the Vita, I didn't pick it up because honestly, Sony didn't put a lot of work into it. The reason the Vita died is because basically a lot of their games were just like either ports of like games that are on the console already, so why would I want the game mobile when I already have it on console, or just like crappy versions of console games. So a lot of the there's not really a lot of push or like interest in the mobile, unlike we have the Nintendo 3DS or the Nintendo the new Nintendo 3DS. And the push for, that was awful. And the push for that is, there's always Pokemon on there. And I think that's something that, is going to, keep, that might possibly, I'm kind of jumping ahead of topics, but might possibly keep handhelds in general alive, because there's always Pokemon, and that's always, there as the saving kind of light.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking earlier about why, I ended up buying handheld consoles, because, I had a bit of a break between the Nintendo DS and then the new Nintendo 3DS. So I didn't have anything in between there. But when I was growing up, I had the Game Boy Color and then the Game Boy Advance and then the Nintendo DS. I got the new generation every time it came out solely to play Pokemon. That was why I got the handheld, because you need it to play Pokemon. Of course, I definitely was interested in some of the other stuff they had on it, but I wouldn't have got the console just for that. So I played Nintendogs, when the Nintendo first came out when I was 12 or something, but that's not why I got the DS. I got the DS so that I could play Pokemon, Pearl and Diamond, and that was it. And then even when I finally decided to get my new Nintendo 3DS, which I got for Christmas actually, I was really pushing hard for it forever, and that was also mostly because I wanted to play the new Pokemon games they had, with my brother, and he got his as well. Although I will say that I've been more interested as I've gotten older in other types of games, and I think they've expanded the types of games they have on handheld consoles. I'm kind of interested in what games work best on consoles that are handheld as opposed to just Pokemon, you know, like things that really can only be done with handheld that can't be done well on a like home system, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is I never played Xenoblade Chronicles. I think I do want to play it eventually because it has a lot of hype. It looks like a beautiful game. But people were talking about how it's almost too big of a game to run on the DS, the new Nintendo 3DS, and that it's like the game, like it works on it, but it kind of barely works. Like it's more of a console game than a handheld. So I don't know if there's a certain game. I definitely feel like Pokemon's a great mobile game. Maybe just because I've been conditioned to think it is, and maybe because Pokemon Go is coming out soon.
Yeah.
But I think there's something. I guess. Yeah, I don't know what makes a good mobile game. I guess RPGs kind of lend themselves in a way because they're slower paced. You know, the kind of one big thing I loved about in the console in the mobile, the handheld like generations. Is once the DS came out, which I also had the same gap as you. I went from DS to new 3DS. But the thing I loved about the DS and even the SP, even though I didn't like the SP at all as a system, I thought it was hideous and I hated it. And I hated people who had it because it was ugly. And I hated seeing it play it. It was so gross. But I did love even though I didn't know that I loved this at the time, I loved the ability to close it. I thought that was like a big game changer in the handheld like industry because now I don't have to, not only do I mean, obviously I can pause it and turn it off and turn it back on, and theoretically save the game. Most games let you save whenever at this point, except for a couple like God of War and things you have to save at little stations. But yeah, I think that's a big push. That's a big part of handheld. So like with Pokemon a lot, I'll be playing it and then I'll close it and then I'll like leave it for a while and I'll come back. So I think games that are slower paced kind of lend themselves to handhelds in that way. I think also like maybe games, and this might be kind of an extreme statement, but I feel like I get the feeling that sometimes games that go to handhelds are kind of like games that have like a little bit more of a cult following or kind of games that are a little more niche.
Yeah.
So I think about like Luigi's Mansion came out, the new Luigi's Mansion, and I loved Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube. I loved it. And it came out for the 3DS, and like I got that immediately. Either immediately when it came out or immediately when I got the 3DS. I don't remember which came first at this point. But yeah, like I loved having that game, and I'm pretty sure it's exclusive to being on handheld, and that kind of makes sense because it's like a niche thing. And then for PSP, my favorite game on that was Daxter, which is there's the trilogy of Jak and Daxter is like the sidekick to Jak. So Daxter got his own game on the PSP. So I feel like sometimes it's used for like those kind of not more, I guess like kind of more obscure games or like storylines that you wouldn't normally see on the console. Even though Luigi's Mansion started on console and it was a big deal and a lot of people loved it. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that you're right about it having to be more of a slow-paced game usually, because when I sit down with my DS, it's not, for something like, I don't know, not something huge and exciting and, just fast-paced. I want something that's sort of relaxing. I think part of that has to do just with how I grew up with handheld consoles. It was sort of the thing that I would play, on road trips. So if we drove to, like, California, it'd be, like, 4 or 5 hours, and Mike and I might just, like, start a new Pokemon game and just sit there for 4 hours straight just playing. Or just, like, where you can just lay down in your house somewhere. When I was a kid, I think I would, like, lay a lot of times, like, lay on my back and like have my feet propped up against the wall, and you can just like sort of look at it like that. And that's not a really good position to be in if you're playing like a crazy fight game or something. Not that you can't have like fighting games on the handheld. I know that like Super Smash Brothers has some handheld versions, although I haven't personally played them yet, so I can't really speak to how well those work. But I know that I have friends who enjoy it a lot, so there's that. But I think there are certain games that sort of they work well on the console and on the handheld. A few that come to mind are like Animal Crossing and Harvest Moon, and those more sort of like they're sort of just like cute and fun games, You see iterations of those on the console and on the handheld versions, but I think what the important thing that the developers for those do is they have a different game on the console than the game they have released for the handhelds. So it's not like you talked about, some things are just sort of like versions of a console game for handheld, and I've seen those a lot, and they're usually really, really crappy. But like Harvest Moon, I was super into when I was a kid, and it's still sort of like this really like therapeutic, relaxing game for me. And you can't play like the same game on the console you can on handheld. They're different games. So I think if a developer is going to have games on both, they need to be significantly different, have different storylines, have different abilities while you're playing. But I guess I don't see that as often as I'd like to. And I think I would like to see more games that are just built strictly for handhelds, because Pokemon does that and it's really successful. They have games on the console, like Pokemon XD or like Pokemon Coliseum and stuff I played on the GameCube when I was a kid, and those are kind of fun, but they're not the Pokemon games. They're just sort of these offshoots that are interesting, but they're not really what you want, So I think that a lot of handheld games would do better if, or a lot of handheld consoles even would do better if people spent more time focusing on having games that were built for the handheld and that ran really well on handheld.
Yeah, absolutely. So that being said, we know the death of the PS Vita is well on its way. In the last E3, no new games were announced for it, and that's how you know it's starting to leave. The Wii U is also dying. A lot of things are dying. We're surrounded by death. So with that in mind, what do you think is going to happen to handhelds in general, and also is anyone going to step up to fill? To fill kind of the gap? We have Nintendo, and I think they're going to keep going with that. And we know Sun and Moon's coming out, though, which I'm hoping will be a new Nintendo 3DS exclusive. Just because I bought the new one and I want to feel like I have something over other people, which is awful, but I just do. Because there have been almost no exclusives if any exclusives for the new version, so it'd be cool to have some of those. Though I don't think they would do that because it would probably be polarizing. But right, do we think Sony's going to make another handheld? Personally, I'm curious as if Microsoft is ever going to make a handheld, because they haven't done that yet. And so far, they're really doing really, really financially well as a company. So I think and Nintendo's kind of on shaky ground right now. So I think now would be an interesting time for them to, not necessarily coming out with it immediately, but I think it'd be an interesting time for them to strike with something like that.
I'd really like to see Microsoft try a handheld. So I'm sort of, rightly or wrongly, I've always been an Xbox person. With certain things coming out like Uncharted 4 that I can't play, I'm like, man, maybe I should have went the PlayStation route. But I've always been an Xbox person. Ever since the split happened. I guess where you can play the same games on both, because before you just had to own both. But so I have this sort of, I feel like a little bit loyal to Xbox and Microsoft, and I would definitely get a handheld if they came out with one, unless it just looked awful, And I think there's a lot of players like that. I think they could do really well, and they could bring something new to the table. Because the thing about Nintendo, and I love Nintendo, and I mostly, as far as Nintendo goes, I mostly just had their handheld stuff most of my life, and they do what they do really well, but it's still what they do. You know what I mean? Someone else could do something really different from them, and it would be interesting and different enough that I'd be willing to play. So I think Microsoft should definitely get in on that if it's a possibility. As far as what Sony's going to do, I'm not really sure, because for me, the Sony handhelds have always been when I was a kid, I didn't really know what a PSP was. I didn't really understand why anyone had one, because I was over there with my Game Boy Advance. So it always seemed sort of like an off-brand thing to me. I didn't know it was a Sony-owned thing. I just didn't understand what it was. And so I've never been interested in Sony handhelds. I didn't even know what the PS Vita was until very recently, when I sort of was looking into buying a handheld console, and I of course went with the 3DS. But if the Sony's going to continue with trying to bring out handhelds, then they're really going to have to step up their game. And what they have going for them, what Sony has going for them, is they have a lot of these amazing exclusives. Microsoft has exclusives too, but I just don't think they're quite as good as the Sony exclusives. And if Sony could really put that into their handheld games more, that might work well for them. But it might be too late. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm definitely gonna pick up a Vita because at this point I'm kind of collecting consoles anyway of the main kind of when consoles come to mind. I want to get all those, and then I want to get like the more kind of lesser known ones like the Neo Geo and things as time goes on.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna collect it as like a collector's piece, and also like I like Sony and I like their handhelds and things, and I had a fun time with my PSP. So I'll probably get that, but yeah, I'd be really interested in a Microsoft handheld because they haven't tried that yet. And I'm new to Microsoft. I'm a Nintendo person and a Sony person, so this is my first, my Xbox One, which is behind me, is my first system that I've ever owned from Microsoft. I was pretty against like Xbox because it kind of has that, for me, it has that stigma of like being kind of shooter based and things like that. Nothing wrong with those games, but I don't play shooters. Nintendo obviously is like, you know, fluffy town.
Yeah.
But what I loved about them was that they have like these great action adventure games. And I love Mario, obviously. Like, and then, you know, Luigi's Mansion was great. Zelda's fun, even though I haven't actually played a lot of Zelda. Yeah, so they just always have had these really heavy hitter franchises. Though their folly is that they haven't really made a lot outside of that.
Right.
So how many Zelda games can you make and Mario games can you make before it like kind of dries out? And somehow it hasn't dried out. They keep doing new things with it, which is really impressive because so many other franchises, like I think of, even though you're not familiar with Ratchet and Clank, to me the Ratchet and Clank franchise is really boring to me. It seems like the same thing over and over again. And that's like kind of something I'm not as interested in at this point. But yeah, with Microsoft, I think a handheld would be really interesting because they were always like one of the big people when it came to indies. You know, obviously Nintendo's behind on that curve, and I think Xbox has been doing a pretty good job with their indies. If they get them a little faster and things, that'd be kind of nicer. But Unravel was kind of an indie. I mean, they collaborated with EA, so you could debate on if that's an indie or not.
Right.
They had at E3, they showed that was like one of their big things last year, showing indies. So I could see the indies going into handhelds really nicely.
I would love that.
That's where they would have I think that's where they would have a big strength. I would love just playing indies on a handheld like all day. That would be great. So, and they definitely, I feel like they have the technology to like make some really good graphics on their handheld. So I think that would be cool.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll see some more stuff. I personally really want to have more handhelds. So here's looking to the future.